as part of my ongoing history series. We are joined by author Richard Rhodes. He's the author of Hell and Good Company, The Spanish Civil War and the World It Made. He's the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Making of the Atomic Bomb. And Richard's published 24 previous works of history. Richard, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Richard, as I see it, the Spanish Civil War, which took place in the years leading up to World War II, starting 1936 to 1939, it's one of those wars where it's really difficult, for me anyway, to discern of a good or a bad player in it. I mean, on the one side you had the loyalists who were backed by Stalin. On the other side you had Franco's nationalists who were backed by Hitler and Mussolini. Your book tends to paint, I think, somewhat of a rosy picture of the loyalist side of the conflict. And, again, I mean, I think that to do so, either side, one would have to have either pro-fascist or pro-communist sympathies.
Well, except that the government in Spain at that time, the one that Franco and his fellow generals were trying to overthrow, was really a coalition government. Yes, there was support from Stalin and a hope on Stalin's part that he could prevent the fascists from taking control of the Mediterranean. But the government was elected by the people. There was a range of political parties ranging from what I guess we would probably call liberal Democrats on the right to out-and-out anarchists on the left, with the communists
right, sure.
in there mostly under some control by the other parties involved. There was a lot of inter-party fighting, of course, that went on. But I didn't have much trouble identifying who the bad guys were, and I think that was Franco's
right.
side.
I got that.
Side, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that comes out quite clearly, and I would argue that it's a little more nuanced than that, in that the government, the coalition government, the Popular Front government headed by Largo Caballero, which took power in February-March 1936. I mean, he presided, and the government was presiding over, according to what I've read, a rapid breakdown of law and order. And there was an increase of all sorts of terrorism that was occurring across the countryside, with the murder of priests and the burning of churches and rape and, kind of an atmosphere that's very similar to others, particularly we could point to Bolshevik Russia, where before the authoritarians took over and created a more pure communist state, you had a great deal of agitation and disorder. And I think that this condition, headed by this Caballero, who was a demagogue, who was calling for brutal revolution even after he'd taken power, had echoes several years earlier in a rebellion in the province of Asturias. Now, in that case, there was the government, which was a left-of-center government, gave 3 cabinet positions to members of this group called CEDA, which is viewed as a right-wing group. I'm not sure they were. I think they were pro-Catholic and they were conservatives. And the result was a strike that was launched by a communist-controlled union that led to an outright rebellion, and you had basically the overthrow of local governments to be replaced by these committees, very similar to Soviets. You had burning of buildings and churches. You had terrorism. And that government, that left-of-center government, called Franco in 1934 to put down the rebellion, and he did so quite brutally.
So
I think that what happened...
There was
but what happened then...
Go ahead.
In 1936, then, 2 years later, when you had the Popular Front government, which included many of these same people who were in Asturias, the CEDA group, Franco sent a letter to the president saying that if the country was going to descend into anarchy and a breakdown of law and order, then he'd return. And I think that had that government been able to, kind of consolidate control over the countryside and retain a level of law and order, he would not have returned.
Oh, I don't agree with you at all. I think, in fact, there was a long tradition in Spain of generals deciding that they should take over the country and bring it to what they called law and order, which was far from a democratic set of institutions. I think that the government was basically a centered government, and it struggled with revolution from the right, and it struggled with revolution from the left. It was certainly being harassed in both directions. But if you look at what happened after the after the invasion by Franco and his North African forces began, the government fairly quickly took control over the kind of disorder that you're talking about. There was a great slaughter of priests in the first weeks of the war. Some 6,000 were lined up and shot. But as soon as the government got some control over the militias, that kind of atrocity stopped, except for, and you're certainly right about this, the Soviet Union slipped in a large number of KGB kind of operators who did their assassinating all throughout the war. But I don't think that the government would have ended up a communist government. I think it would have ended somewhere else, as in fact it did. So from my point of view, and I think from the point of view of some historians at least, Franco's defeat of the duly elected government of Spain was a tragedy for the country and continued to be until his death in 1975.
Well, Richard, I'm not here to defend Franco. I mean, as I said, I think that the issue is quite nuanced. I think that both sides were, I mean, I don't know which was worse, actually, in the real sense. I mean, my point is that the way you have conducted your research, you tend to put all of the blame on one side. I would argue that the atrocities that occurred in this war, even the one you just mentioned, the slaughter of 7,000 priests, it was being done by both sides. It was not, an either-or type situation. And as far as the loyalist government goes, I would imagine that the reason why the breakdown of law and order stopped after Franco landed was because of Stalin and because Stalin's forces, including the French communists who came in under Duclos and the Italian communists, all of whom were controlled by the Kremlin, according to Hugh Thomas, who was a British journalist.
In fact,
I'm quoting from Hugh Thomas, who was a British journalist who was there.
I know.
That's my source.
I know those who say that they were all controlled by Moscow. But then you'd have to explain why Moscow decided to pull out halfway through the war.
Because they lost. Because they saw that they were going to lose. By 1938, it was quite clear that Stalin cut his losses. Plus, Stalin had already entered into a tacit agreement with Adolf Hitler that eventually came out in the open in 1939 when Hitler and Stalin launched World War II.
Rather simplistic version of the way Spanish politics worked. Someone called the Spanish politics system a labyrinth, and my God, it certainly was. There were parties of every color and stripe from all sides of including within the so-called communist range. They were not by any means all controlled by Moscow. Indeed, one of the reasons
they weren't, and I don't think anyone
to assassinate was because he was so opposed to some of the other communist groups.
No, you're right, and I don't think anyone's suggesting that was the case. Again, I'm looking at Hugh Thomas's work here. He says that Stalin went in and only helped the forces in the government that were pro-Stalin, and he opposed other groups, including leftist groups, who were not pro-Stalin.
Absolutely.
But the point is that Stalin tried to stage manage the loyalist side, and by 1937, 1938, it does appear that he had really co-opted the government there, and then he cut his losses.
To the contrary, but then he was pulling out.
Yeah, he pulled out when he saw that he was going to lose,
well,
and also when he entered into the alliance with Hitler.
And also that he pulled out.
Well, he in classic communist style. It's like flipping a switch. Overnight, the policy changed. Just like overnight, the left suddenly supported Hitler after Stalin entered into his agreement with Hitler.
Was left running Spain at that point?
Well, I think at that point, probably, in fact, he did Franco had the upper hand, and he finished it off. I mean, in 1939,
there was a long
with a couple
period
of decisive
between,
battles.
In terms of months, the war was not that long. There was a long period before, after Stalin withdrew his support for the war, when there was still a government, there was still a military, they were still fighting. They were slowly withdrawing because Franco had the support of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, and Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany had no interest in losing that war. So they kept supporting Franco throughout. But to think that the government was communist, I think, really, really oversimplifies. It was a complex government with lots of different political positions involved. It was indeed a coalition government.
And I'm not suggesting otherwise, only in that it presided over a rapid breakdown of law and order with a move towards Soviet-style system. That stopped when Franco landed.
So are you referring to the beginning of the war now, the beginning of the
very
war?
beginning. Exactly.
The government did manage to take control, ultimately, over these informally organized militias. And why were they organized? Because they were trying to defend their country against Franco and his North African mercenaries.
You're talking about the government itself, the loyalist government itself.
Yes.
In other words, once Franco landed, they were able to consolidate control.
They were indeed.
I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm only suggesting that consolidation of control appeared to coincide with the huge footprint of Stalin, and with Franco, the big footprint of Adolf Hitler. Also, when we take a look at the Spanish Civil War in retrospect, we're looking at it with the demonized and evil forces of Nazism after, of course, the Nazis, along with the Soviets, launched World War II, and after the Holocaust against the Jews. So it colorizes, I think, how we look at that situation. But the fact is that in 1936, 1937, during that time, Hitler was still, viewed as a progressive, which he was by classic standards, running a nanny state in Germany by most of the world, and that this was before the Holocaust. It was before World War II, and yet Stalin was presiding over a regime that was known to be evil. I mean, Lenin had already slaughtered up to 5 million people by 1919 before Hitler had even gotten started. He had already set up a concentration camp system in Russia called the Gulag, which was modeled by his fellow Nazis. He had already set up a national police service, the Cheka, which would go out and slaughter entire collective groups of people who were viewed as enemies of the state, modeled by the Nazis as the Gestapo. And my guest is Richard Rhodes. He's the author of Hell and Good Company, The Spanish Civil War and the World It Made. Richard is also a Pulitzer Prize winner for the book The Making of the Atomic Bomb. Richard, I guess my point is that at the time of the Spanish Civil War, the Soviets were a known entity in the world, at least amongst most average Europeans. Whereas the Nazis, as evil as they were not yet at that level of authoritarianism and venality that had already been implemented in Russia. So when we look at the situation post-war, it's we're clouded by our view of what did become the Nazi regime, which was a totalitarian regime that participated in World War II and that slaughtered 6 million Jews. But at the time, I think that one could argue that a communist takeover of Spain would have been far worse in terms of human rights abuses and deprivation and the creation of poverty and suffering by people than it would have been otherwise. Well, I say it because of the Bolshevik example, not to mention other examples like
that I basically don't cover in my book. My book is about the development of blood transfusion and new surgical techniques. It's about firebombing of cities. It's about the use of that war as a test bed for new military and civilian technologies. Those are the issues that I try to cover. These political arguments have been covered by some 500 books on the Spanish Civil War. And I don't see, and I didn't see when I wrote this book, the point in rehashing the issues. Does it really matter whether the Soviets are the ones who developed stored blood transfusion in the 1920s? The point is, it was brought into use in Spain in an innovative way, and then was ready when the Second World War came along to save countless lives, and so forth.
Well, no, I understand, Richard, that was not the main topic of your book, but the reason I bring it up is because the book does appear, and I've read a good part of it, to paint a somewhat rosy picture of the loyalists and a villainous picture strictly of the nationalists. I would argue that both sides had enormous crimes of atrocity, and that both sides, in a sense, a more balanced view would be that. this wasn't a war, I would argue, where there was a good and bad side.
He's the one who gives you your balanced view. I was interested in talking about technologies, about individual experiences, about the love affairs between the nurses who came from England and some of the members of the International Brigade, and then their loss and their struggle with their feelings. These are the issues that I found interesting. All these decades after that war is ancient history.
No, and you did a great job of that. I'm simply getting into the underlying ideological bias in the book. As far as the people, the personalities, and the various figures that were involved in supporting the loyalist side, were they also pro-Nazi during the Hitler-Stalin Pact period, which followed the war?
They
generally?
were never Nazi, the people that I'm writing about. To the
okay,
contrary.
Because the Communist Party was. If they were communist, I'd wonder if they...
Why
I don't think it's funny. I actually don't think it's funny.
I really don't understand your perspective here. You're not talking about the book I wrote. So let's talk about the book I wrote. And there we're talking.
Well, the book you wrote is, we could talk about. Sure, we could finish up the interview by talking about some of the personal stories. I'm just pointing out the ideological basis as I see it here.
Well, I didn't write
and that's
about
fine,
the
by the way.
ideological case. And the fact that
but the book has that.
might have been developed by people who believed in communism seems to me completely irrelevant. They are technologies that took lives. They are technologies that took lives. The bombing of Guernica was...
obviously, individuals who embraced communism could be great people. Ernest Hemingway is one of my favorite authors, and I admire his work. That's fine. I'm pointing out the ideology that they embraced, whether wittingly or otherwise, was one that was destructive, and that fascinates me. In a sense, it makes it more interesting.
War. The atrocities you're talking about that were committed by all these local militias at the beginning of the war basically ended early in the war on the nationalist side. On the loyalist side. But they certainly didn't end on Franco's side. His people went into the towns that they conquered and systematically slaughtered all the military-age males. That was not going on after the first months of the war on the loyalist side. So
I think it went on both sides.
Well,
I think it went on both sides. And I wonder if Franco wasn't going after people who might have been part of what he viewed as a communist element, who previously had been involved in the atrocities.
He executed someone.
I don't think either side should have lined anybody up.
Journalist and American patriot. This is Chuck Morse Speaks.
Thanks so much. Richard Rhodes is my guest. He's the author of Hell and Good Company, The Spanish Civil War and the World It Made, available at all major bookstores. Richard, a lot of the personalities that you write about who were involved in supporting the loyalist side, these people were certainly on the left. Many of them were formally part of the Communist Party. Many of them were not. My question to you is more of a fundamental question here, which is exactly what drove them to that. Did they really believe that communism would offer some kind of a better life for people? Did they think that communism was a better system than American capitalism?
Most of the people who volunteered to fight in the Spanish Civil War thought that if they could defeat fascism in Spain, they might be able to forestall a second world war. That may have been a forlorn hope on their part, but that was their hope, and many of them sacrificed their lives because of that. as far as your obsession evidently with communism, I certainly don't think that they intended to install a communist government in Spain or anywhere else. They simply volunteered with the hope that they could fight against fascism, and they did, and unfortunately they lost.
Right, and by the way, my obsession, as you call it, with communism is equal to my obsession with Nazism, and as a Jew who had family members slaughtered in the Holocaust, I kind of resent the implication that these would be obsessions. But putting that aside, I wonder how many of the same people, and I don't question their motives, although I think they were naive, how many of them embraced Hitler after the Hitler-Stalin Pact of August 1939, when the International Communist Party became pro-Hitler. The International Communist Party became pro-Hitler in the first 2 years of World War II.
Switched around to Hitler?
Look at the United States.
I really don't understand where you're coming from, but you're not talking about my book. And if you want to talk about the politics of the war, you should interview Hugh Thomas. I'm signing off now. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Yeah, I don't think that's something that he was comfortable to question there. And the question is, were the people who were pro-Soviet or pro-communist before the Hitler-Stalin Pact, did they sign on to Hitler after the Hitler-Stalin Pact? The International Communist Party in the United States and in the Western democracies, they were pro-Hitler after the signing of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. That's a fact of history. That's provable very easily. They supported Hitler because Stalin entered into a pact with Hitler, and together Hitler and Stalin launched World War II. So, I mean, these are simple facts of history, and there were many people in the Communist Party in the United States and in Europe, and of those, I would say certainly the French Duclos, who was the head of the French Communist Party, and in the United States, people who were sort of the famous Hollywood screenwriters and people like Lawson and Ring Lardner and them, and the heads of the various communist and pro-communist unions, which actually engaged in work stoppages to help prevent the United States from arming itself, that these people were effectively pro-Nazi because that was the Communist Party line at the time. So I don't think that my question is at all unreasonable. And, in fact, I'll state the answer because Mr. Rhodes was maybe too upset to do so. Maybe it forced perhaps him to confront something in his own thinking that might have even thrown a little glimmer of conscience in there. But the fact of the matter is that the communist left after August of 1939 was pro-Nazi. And by the way, Richard Rhodes is not the first person on the left that I've talked about this with who has hung up on me indignantly. I'm indignant over their support of Hitler. Is the ongoing saga with Hillary Clinton and her emails. It says here, the AP, the Associated Press, is suing the State Department seeking access to the records of former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, that being the email records. And in the course of that, Hillary admitted yesterday in her speech with the media, or her press event, that she had deleted 30,000 emails under the guise that they were personal, but of course no one knows whether they were personal or not. The fact is she was using her account for State Department business, which is, by the way, something that previous government officials had done. I mean, she's not the only one. But, for example, in the case of Colin Powell, he used a personal account, but he turned the whole thing over, including the hard drive, to the State Department for publication after he left office, something Hillary is refusing to do. But is this scandal going to derail her plans or her ambitions to become the next president and to be the nominee? And it's also, I would argue, to be viewed as a double scandal in that it comes on top of the revelation that as Secretary of State, she had concurrently arranged for multiple millions of dollars in foreign in donations from foreign countries and from corporations doing business in those countries to the Clinton, whatever they call it, the Clinton Foundation, the Clinton Library, whatever it is, which brings up highly ethical questions about pay to play, using her position as Secretary of State both to represent the United States but also to get these donations. I mean, that's the appearance. Will she get away with it? I actually think she probably will. I think that she probably will go on to become the nominee. She very well may go on to become president and to be elected. And I think this because the Clintons have always gotten away with this. I mean, when he was governor of Arkansas, she was put on the board of directors of every major corporation in that state, including Walmart. And when I say board of directors, that's a big check that goes into the Clinton coffers in exchange for maybe a few meetings, a couple of banquets. And then as president, they did the same thing with the Clinton Library, and then as Secretary of State, they did it internationally. So, yeah, she'll get away with it.